All right. Welcome to meeting number 2 for the month of August for the Research Agenda Coordination Working Group for the Offshore Wind Roadmap. We all know each other. This is open conversation time. Uh, yeah, as I mentioned, we did have one of these a week or two ago, and that video is up on YouTube and on our website for those who want to catch up to what the others have said. And that was our first run through of a recommendation draft that I just put some language together as food for thought, trying to see what conversation it sparks. Um, so my goal for today is to roll through that with this group and see what thoughts you have, what adjustments I might need to make to the document to get us to our third meeting, which is on the 26th of August. And then based on all that, I have a draft due to my manager on the 29th of the full draft roadmap that I'll be sending out to the roundtable sometime in mid-September. So we're going to run it through our internal process and then get it out to you all and have our September 30th resumption of roundtable conversations. So this is timely stuff, and I'll appreciate any thoughts you all have on how to get there. What you would notice looking at the draft, though, is that there are going to still be some gaps even in the September draft, and especially for this topic, which is related to the research agenda piece that is kind of being worked off to the side by the Science and Technical Advisory Committee of OPAC, Ocean Policy Advisory Council. Karina Nielsen is leading a group of experts to do the overview of what concerns they're gathering from our process, from other sources, and doing an assessment of where they think we are and where some major research priorities ought to be for the state. We're not going to see that until I think October or maybe even January. Let me double check. Yeah, the final deliverables in January, but there will be some early feedback opportunities around the October timeframe. And the idea is we will fold that into the roadmap and make it an appendix, but pull forward some of those priority research areas. And we'll also have our opportunity to put our stamp on it and say, well, we think something ought to be elevated or whatnot. So we're not going to see the research agenda in the September draft is the bottom line. We're also waiting for some work to be done down in California as they are building a West Coast Science Collaborative. Hi, Creed. And Dean, I see you. Hello, Julia. Shayna, hi. Lucy, welcome everybody. I'm just kind of giving the rundown here. So the research agenda piece, we're not going to see for the September draft just yet, but I've put in some structure in this recommendation so that when it's available, we know what to do with it. And then for the research coordination piece, that's where I'm kind of waiting to see what comes out of California. They received some seed money from their legislature in the last session to start up a regional science collaborative. But really, they're focusing on building the California body of that first. And they're right now developing a charter and a governance structure for what that science collaborative would look like. And if you remember back a couple of working group meetings ago, I showed some box and line drawings of what I remember from their early thoughts that it would include state agencies and some fishermen and tribes and universities, other interest groups to kind of make a science table that can be part of directing the research that they do, assessing the state of knowledge as it continues to change. And then as I've been talking with counterparts down in California and also with Washington, there is an interest in making this a regional table so that we have an opportunity to work together on some things where we have mutual interest and to learn from one another. What's not clear is how many seats would be saved for Oregon and Washington to be part of that. We may only get one seat, maybe two. And so then that begs the question, does Oregon need to develop its own table of interests and those who would be vetting the science and working together toward consensus, that then we could send an emissary over that way. So what you'll see in the draft are a couple of different options for ways that we as a state might interact with the regional science body. And Shana, I'm glad to see you here because I sent you some questions on email about what the experience has been on the East Coast. And I know you're getting one started up in the Gulf, how the state to state conversations tend to go. So I'm hoping we can discuss that today. In other news, if anyone wants to talk about the Bowen Wind Energy area being rescinded, I'm happy to talk about that if you have any questions. Or I'll just open the floor in the beginning here based on things I've said so far. If you have some questions, some early thoughts before we start diving into details.
Jeff, I just wanted to share, I can certainly provide an update on the OPAC stack working groups.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
So they're moving along at a reasonable clip. The one of the things they were developing was a research prioritization framework, and that working group did complete an initial draft at their last meeting. Jeff, were you at that meeting? I'm just curious. I wasn't. I had a
Yes. I was there for the discussion, but I actually didn't see the draft that came out.
Okay, they sent me something, and so I was going to review the video anyway. So there is a draft product out of that group. There are two other working groups, subgroups on the stack who are working on different aspects. One is just sort of a comprehensive look-see of like what are the research gaps and knowledge gaps at the current time, and then another work group that is working more on social science and economic sort of questions and trying to understand that. So the full OPAC needs to, the full stack needs to come together and talk about all these pieces, and then they're going to be ready to present out. So progress being made, and we're trying to make things that are evergreen, I guess, given the changing timelines and likelihood that we may not need to implement this, and a lot of data and information will be forthcoming between when we develop this and when we might actually use it or apply it. So that we've sort of kind of shifted tactics a little bit to reflect that reality. So I think that, anyway, I think that gives you just a kind of a thumbnail sketch of where that process is.
Great. Go ahead, Shana.
Thanks, Jeff. I wrote in the chat, I have your email open and I'm working on a response, but I was curious to what degree you've been coordinating with Abby Moen, who's currently in charge of the structure of the West Coast Science Entity. I know that, and if you don't mind keeping this among folks on this call, I know that she has conveyed to me that the—
One sec, Shana. This will be on YouTube later, just for your awareness.
Oh, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
I will say this because I'm not sure how open she wants to be about this. I know that there is a discussed timeline about when the announcement for the launch of the West Coast Science Entity is going to be, and that is imminent. And so I'm curious if she's been able to talk to you about the number of seats that she expects for Oregon or Washington, or if she's given you a timeline for when she'll make that decision, given the timeline for launching the entity. I'll pause right there for just a second.
Yeah, I spoke with Abby probably about a month ago or so, and she indicated that there would be some early reach out to Oregon and Washington around this time with some of the early drafts out of the charter, but I really don't know beyond that.
Okay. That is about the timeline from when I last spoke to her. So I was just curious if things had changed at all, or if you had also had the most recent info. I do have given the timeline for this document and the decision making that we have, would it be helpful for there to be additional outreach to help push for those decisions and for seats at the table and to help us as we're making the decision for this document.
Well, I mean, we do have, so the big picture timeline for the roadmap is we have a September draft that the roundtable will look at. Then that will be turned into a November draft. So we're going to be taking feedback another round of feedback there, and then a public draft in the January, February timeframe that will open up for formal public comment. Try to resolve all those comments by about April, and then be ready by the summertime to submit something to the legislature. So we do have some time for things to still come in. I don't know if that answers your question.
I happened to be speaking with her on Friday for something, and
Okay.
was wondering if it would be helpful if I brought it up again,
Sure.
for Oregon.
Yeah, the sooner we can start plugging in together on this, it'll help us understand what kind of resource needs the state might have, or the the various levels of stateside development we need to do.
Okay. And then I am curious, do you want me to talk now about how different tables maintain their working groups, or would you rather me respond via email? I can do both, and respond in more detail via email. I'm happy. I know that just because you mentioned the email, happy to do whatever works best.
If y'all are okay with it, let's have a conversation about it now. Hopefully I've teed up the topic enough that everyone's understanding what we're here, what this part is, but go ahead.
Well, maybe I can just clarify for myself just to make sure. But when you say maintain science table, do you mean how it's funded and like the durability piece of like how it's either legally mandated, or whether it's at like the decision of the governor's office to continue the table? Is that kind of the piece when you're thinking about maintenance?
I guess here, let me show my screen. But what I'm thinking about is this idea that California, we know, is going to set up their own science entity, their own science collaborative, to be kind of the red phone for their agencies when they need to pick it up and talk to the science. But it's also a place to help, like, try to build a consensus around what we know, is kind of what I understand it to be, to help direct research priorities and funding that developers need to do. And just from first blush, it looks like it's going to have a lot of seats already, just because of the sheer number of people that they want to have sit at that table. But they've also talked about it being regional in nature. And so, you know, there's a version of it where I could see them saving us a seat or two. I don't imagine they're going to give us 30 seats and themselves 30 seats and Washington 30 seats. It would just be a lot to manage. So if my assumption is right, that Oregon is going to get a seat or two at California's led table where they're investing in it, putting in. Now, the question that becomes, how do we as a state best represent our research needs and our interests in a California led table? And so the two options that came to my mind first, the first one is kind of the Cadillac option, where the state of Oregon creates our own version of what California is doing, where it's multiple parties sitting around a table together that brings in the state and federal agencies, tribal staff, researchers, fisheries users, other non-governmental interests to be, I'm just reading for here, to be a clearinghouse for the state for science, direction of research dollars toward priority areas, so that we could have kind of our own consensus as Oregon, and then maybe send an emissary to the California table to be that connection there. That's probably the higher resource need for the state. And there'd be a question of when is the right time to build this, given that with no wind energy areas right now off of Oregon and where we're at, that we're probably some years off before we before we urgently need it. Option two would be to just use the state agencies that we have and maybe just send an agency representative to the California table to keep an eye on what's going on there, to keep a copy of our roadmap and our research agenda that we bring to that table, and then find some venue in Oregon, be it OPAC or some other, way to have regular public check-ins in Oregon, basically just to give status updates on what's happening in California. And then at some point, option two could evolve into option one if we decide, okay, we really need to set up our own table now. So that's what's in my head.
That's really helpful to understand better. I think that what's currently happening on the East Coast is a bit of an amalgamation. So the RWC is, of course, the science table for the whole region. And there is you described it in this document, but the 4-sector model includes the state representatives, the ENGOs, industry, and federal representatives. It's not clear how each state chooses which representatives end up on the state panel, but many of the states have their own individual science tables, and a lot of those people do cross-pollinate between the state panel and the RWSC, but there's not really a formal structure for how they've decided to do that. So, for example, with New York, their state table is called the Environmental Technical Working Group, the ETWIG. It's part of the New York State Energy Development Authority, which is commonly called NYSERDA. And NYSERDA tackles a huge amount of science questions on offshore wind and wildlife. They also have a fisheries technical working group as well, the FTWIG, that's a little bit newer. They do that same kind of thing for ROSA, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, which is the fisheries science table. And again, there isn't like a formal way that I think decisions are made of who from ETWIG and FTWIG end up working at the RWSC, but there's a lot of cross-pollination. So for example, I sit in the ETWIG. I also sit on the ENGO sector caucus, and I'm a steering committee member for the RWSC. And there's a number of others who are playing both of those roles. And so a lot of information gets passed over. And then there's also a lot of agreements between NYSERDA and discussions between NYSERDA and RWSC. NYSERDA's ETWIG and FTWIG do independent work constantly, and they do bring over that information to the RWSC, but I don't know that there's like a formal mechanism for how they've made that decision and how they make sure that information is transferred. I think it's mostly relationship based, where they've been coordinating since the inception. I think even NYSERDA might have hosted the meeting that originally conceived the RWSC. Meanwhile, you have other state tables. So I sit on the Connecticut table, which is called the Commission for Environmental Standards. It's hosted by one of the state agencies, and they similarly have representatives who go to the RWSC. But again, I don't know that it's necessarily like you must bring over one person from the CES to represent our needs. I think they take input. A lot of the input is focused on what the state is doing. So like when the state issues a solicitation, that state table is providing feedback to the state. And I'm not, again, that process is more formal than the process of making sure that the CES is communicating to the RWSC. Similarly with the New Jersey group, New Jersey is a little extra complicated. New Jersey has its own table, again, hosted by one of the state agencies. There's a lot of cross-pollination between the state and people who sit on the states, it's, what did they call their group? Like Environmental Technical Working Group. Also, I can't remember the acronym. There's too many acronyms, but they also sit on the RWSC. But then the state also has its own science entity called the Research Monitoring Initiative, and there's cross pollination there as well. And the agency that hosts the working group also hosts the Regional Monitoring Initiative. One state in particular I'd like to call out because they are considering something new that I'm excited about. I believe it's Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a habitat working group that, again, cross-pollinates between, but not necessarily formally. I have not officially begun participating in that one. I'm taking over for my boss when I come back from maternity leave in the new year, but she has been on it for many years. And I can double check with her details, but they are considering legislation that will formalize that group, require it to be considered under law when the state undergoes solicitation, CZMA review, and other important state decisions related to offshore wind. I don't know that other states have that mechanism where the advisory council is formally required to participate and be consulted in the process, which is interesting and perhaps something that Oregon would want to consider. But does that give a taste? Again, I know that that's not like explicitly one of these two options. When it comes to the Gulf and what we're setting up in the Gulf, it's even less formal. The host entity already has collaboration among the 5 Gulf states that work together to create an action plan for the state. But the mechanism for checking in with the state to make sure that they have science tables that are contributing to this entity is not formalized. It's based on volunteers who are coming and working within that host entity on these collective challenges. So that's my understanding so far. Again, I hope that's helpful and explains the variation across the country.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. I think what I am hearing, though, is a consistent theme is that each state is taking responsibility for its own science-related needs to support its own decision-making, and that this regional science collaborative is not taking the place of these independent state groups.
I think that that's a great takeaway. I can't speak for the other states that I'm not as familiar with. Like I don't sit on any North Carolina group. I'm not sure how Virginia tackles it. Again, similarly, not 100% sure about Maryland. I can ask around in my organization if there are differences, but for those that I'm participating in, that is how they've chosen to approach it.
Okay. Yeah, that is helpful. Thank you. Open it up to others. What are you thinking as you're hearing about this question of, the regional table, state-based table, things that we need to be thinking about specific to recommendations that might go into the roadmap?
Seems like, Shannon, what you had described as you had summarized, Jeff, of each state does have to have its own responsibility. And I'm thinking about the ecology on the East Coast versus our California current macro ecosystem. I think that there is a lot to be said for close collaboration. I just feel like if it's just one person sitting on a group that's 29 other people for the state, our input could get lost. So I think it is important that that we have our own group. I'd certainly like to have a larger than just one person on a California group.
Yeah, Jeff, in thinking about, the regional collaboration, it would seem to me that the benefit to the state of Oregon versus the benefit to the state of Washington in participating in a California-led science table would be the the extent to which the scientific data overlaps, and if it does overlap because of the similar geographic proximity and characteristics or what have you, um, then that would go to the question as to the extent it would be necessary for each state to then have their own scientific effort. In other words, it's the overlap that's driving the point that it's relevant to Oregon, right? Right. And it would seem to me, um, in light of the variable in terms of budgetary capacity that California, Oregon, and Washington has, there could be a tremendous benefit to Washington and Oregon, on a California-led effort where potentially high budgetary capacity is there, and yet there's a significant overlap in the relevance of the scientific data being gathered. So, can we have some discussion in that regard? And can that be? I would think that that would be more the driver between option one and option two, because otherwise, it seems to me if we're going to do it anyway, if we're going to invest budget to do our own scientific research, you know, and there's like a zero sum game as far as I'm concerned in terms of whether or not, you know, there's this regional effort has actual meat and benefit.
Yeah, and Dean, I see your hand, but just Kevin, to your point, I'd offer that the easy money, the cheap option of just having the state participate in the California table to look for those opportunities of overlap, that seems like a pretty easy recommendation to make. I think the more difficult recommendation is the timing, composition, resource need if we want to build our own table that is more than just state agencies. Because right now, if we had a review of a project coming in, it mostly leans on the scientific and technical expertise of the agencies who are reviewing that project. I think what we're seeing in the East Coast states and California is a broadening of that table to provide more resources that the state can tap into to answer some of these questions. And so then it comes the question for us and probably for the legislature as well, if a recommendation of the roadmap is to make our own table that is broader than just the state agencies, when is the right time? What does it need to look like? How much is it going to cost? Those are some of the more difficult pieces. But I see some hands here, so I'm going to go in order. Dean?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So Jeff, do you know if the California effort has any scenic resource expertise on that team or not?
I don't.
You don't know? Can you either find out or send me a contact person over there and I could make the inquiry?
I don't think that they've actually picked out who is involved yet in advising for that group for California. I don't
So the
think those
question
selections.
might be, are they planning on recruiting that expertise to that panel or not, even if they don't have a name yet?
No.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So yeah, Jeff, if you can maybe send me a contact over there or make the inquiry yourself and get back to me, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of build off of what Kevin was saying. And this is like Shane will probably be able to speak more in depth to what it is I'm like thinking about here. But in terms of resources for Oregon and Washington, when I'm thinking about scientific research that's regional and what it takes to gather data for the California current throughout, like along the coast, I imagine there'd be things like like devices in the water or people going out and like collecting this data. Like, you know, I know there's like conversations, side conversations happening about LiDAR buoys and should we be investing in those as a state, which would be useful information in and of itself, but very useful information for the potential future of offshore wind and feeding into that kind of baseline data and ongoing data. And I'm thinking for that reason, if there's actual like hardware components and like in real human resources beyond just staffing a table, like if we're relying on California to have a regional approach, is California going to pay for like the science equipment off of the coast of Oregon? I'm going to guess not, right? You know what I mean? So it's like, I think we need to have a consideration about recommendations around if we're going to have a regional, if California, I truly do believe that California is committed to this regional approach. But I still think they're going to probably need help with the limited funding that they have for us to fill in the gaps for that scientific research that's in the California current off of Washington and Oregon. I'm hoping I'm articulating that well. But like,
Mhm.
I just feel like it's in addition to setting a table, it seems like even if all we're doing is sending our people to a table in California, if we want a genuinely regional approach, there's probably going to need to be some investment from Oregon and Washington in and what the off coast research looks like in our geographic regions. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, Shana.
I will say that from what the way that, just to answer your question or to talk about your question, or your comment, the way that that works on the East Coast, the RWSC doesn't itself, I think, fund the research that it conducts. That comes from the uh, procurement, that it has money directed towards RWSC or funds that come from um, the developers themselves. And then the RWC helps to pick how that money gets directed towards different research projects that um, there's like an application process and request for proposals, and that's how that works. And there has been conflict, I think, about how that money should focus on certain states. Like if it's coming from procurement from a certain state, even though it's been directed towards this regional initiative, there's been some conflict about like, well, we want this to focus on our project. And I think they've recently had some success in resolving it with the most recent initiative called Power On, but it would be something that we could talk to Emily about in terms of how they've been handling it, because I recall, and sorry, Emily Shumsheni is the director of the RWSC. I recall Emily bringing up this conflict before. And I don't think it's necessarily just resolved by having all of the states there. I think there's even more complexity. And again, I don't think it would just be answered by us being present, although I do think we should be present. Um, and then uh, in terms of, Julie, I hope that it makes sense in response to your comment. Um, uh, I had originally raised my hand, however, about uh, which option I think is most ideal. And I would consider the best practice that the state has its own advisory table set up. I think it allows you to, that you contribute. So option one, basically, and you're contributing to the California effort through some kind of representation. I really think that Oregon should consider the model that I mentioned before, where we're seeing the advisory or the advice being mandated by the state that you have to consult this group. You get so much more perspective from it. The process, I think, is more inclusive. And I think that there's more buy-in because you have this broad group of experts coming together to uh, advise the state across a multitude of decisions. And I'd love to pass along the language from that legislation if it's something that we want to look at. Um, again, I think it's Massachusetts that put forth that legislation like last month. But again, I would just like to emphasize that I think option one is a really holistic, comprehensive choice for Oregon.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, not that I want to add another dimension to it, but I think it was a main or a large topic of discussion on your previous meeting. It's the use of the regional data, which is a cumulative effects assessment. And that's an area that has been raised by so many people so often. I think that that really does require a cooperative effort across the different states. And not necessarily that that's the driver, but that is a reason for having that communication and cooperation. I actually think that option one of having an individual state by state group is worthwhile, but I do think we want to make sure that the cumulative effects doesn't somehow get lost in the discussion.
Well, I added that to the benefits of joining that collaborative is that we can work with the other states in developing that cumulative impact assessment.
Right.
If there are any other thoughts on this particular topic, happy to do it. We're jumping around a little bit in the document, so I guess where I'd go next is just back up to the top and roll through the full thought process and concept, if that works. Yeah. Okay. Let's back up a bit. So there are two categories of actions that I sent to you all in the recommended language, or really just the draft recommendation language. This is fully open for edits that you all have. Oh, thank you, Shayna. Grab that. See that in the chat. Okay. So the two big pieces. The first piece being develop and pursue a research agenda for Oregon. And the second piece is the one that we just talked about the participation in a regional science collaborative and this question of whether we set up our own as a state. So starting with the research agenda piece, the recommended draft here talks about how through the process of the roadmap and other surrounding efforts, like we saw, NOAA NIMS had their West Coast Science Strategy that we heard about back in January of this year. And there are other efforts like that. But here for the roadmap, I'm highlighting specifically the OPAC stack work that Karina talked about, looking at the literature coupled with uncertainties and effects of concern, and I think hopefully sourcing some of that from the work that we have done as a group. So this is basically pointing to the appendix where that start of a research agenda is going to live. There's then some overall direction in the roadmap about, okay, once we've identified these uncertainties in the research questions, what are the different ways that we would accept resolving those uncertainties? And the options would be to collect new data from comparable projects and ecosystems around the world, so maybe not in Oregon. And Karina, do you want to go ahead and jump in? Oh, you're muted.
When you're done, but before we get off this topic.
Great. Okay. So option one is new data from projects elsewhere that could tell us something about the likelihood or the severity of an effect of concern. Option two would be collecting new data or information specific to Oregon or the California current large marine ecosystem regarding species, habitats, ocean uses, socioeconomic effects, which we can then measure against state policies. So always connecting it back to the policy standard is what we want to be measuring against. Option three would be kind of the after you have steel in the water idea, that there are some things that it may not be possible to learn about until you actually have a project and to watch and see what's happening. So that would involve implementation of adaptive management and monitoring that can identify changes resulting from offshore wind, but that it would need to be coupled with sufficient baseline information, kind of getting us back to option 2 there, and a specified plan of action post-permitting to respond to unexpected changes. So when we talk about the plan of action, there have been some ideas of kind of prescribed actions of, if we find that we're having a particular effect, we're going to curtail or do something. But there is a reality that if a project is already in the water, if it's moored in a particular place, if your transmission cables are a certain length and you can't just move things around necessarily, that other people I've been talking to have described, well, maybe we set aside some like mitigation restoration projects where, if, for example, we're finding that we're having an effect on bird species, we have an idea already in the hopper of restoration that we would do of bird habitat in some other place that could offset that effect somehow, but that you're waiting for a trigger before you would take that kind of action. So those are the 3 that came to mind there. And then at the bottom, I give the nod to the West Coast Science Collaborative, which is what we were just talking about there. Karina, you want to jump in now?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, you know, pulling some of the questions and for the research agenda from some of your work, and that is in fact what we're trying to work on. I wanted to point out to this group, and for us to think about perhaps, some of the questions, you know, when the science team, the stack starts looking at them, they're like, well, this is not a science question, this is a policy question, or this is too broad in scope or so, you know, expansive, it's hard to address or even prioritize. And so there's some, I think, opportunity that it would be good to kind of, and I'm hoping in our presentation of interim outcomes from this work that we will get some ability to work with constituents and folks who are interested in the research agenda to help refine some of those questions. So I just wanted to tee that up, in that we are trying very hard to iterate and absorb and, you know, maybe even kind of reframe slightly in a more scientific way some of the questions that have come up, but that's going to be a space of interest to refining the research agenda.
You had mentioned in our last meeting that, as kind of an expectation setting, reminding people that these are volunteers who are coming together to build this first cut at a research agenda for Oregon, that it likely would not be fully built out with all the detail of, here are the specific studies that if you were to do them, we would have the information that we need, that there would need to be some sort of follow-on process to take that work and continue it.
Yeah, so I mean, your discussion of earlier about like how to fund a research collaborative, et cetera, you know, is very germane, right, to that point, because there's only so much proportion of a faculty member's time that, or, you know, anybody for that matter who's has a different day job can devote to service, right, tasks. So just acknowledging that.
And also that you also made the point that in the next 5 years or so, our sense of the important uncertainties may change because new data may come in, new questions may come in. And so to just have a static list really doesn't make a lot of sense at this point.
Yeah, and the other thing that the team was talking a lot about is just like trying to help understand when data from other locations or studies from other locations, empirical data experience can actually, or basic physics, or, you know, like fundamental logic and understanding of systems can answer questions already without doing new work, and when we need really new work. And in addition, your framing, Jeff, of what can be answered now or in advance versus what needs to wait to be monitored and assessed during a project. those kinds of things. So there's some categorization and thinking around those topics happening right now.
This was something that was covered in the previous meeting, but Karina, I think it might be helpful for you to maybe do like a Cliff Notes version of what you said in the previous meeting about it was kind of I'm wishing I can remember the specific situation you were referring to or practice that you were talking about, but when you were talking about a cumulative impact, assessment, you were like, here's a way that you can kind of get at that without you can't fully answer every question. I forget what it was. You had
yeah,
a process you laid out. There was something that happens in a different space that like I was like, oh, that is an approach that we could
yes.
adapt for this. Can you remind us, just jog my memory and say it
Yeah,
for the
I
room?
was reflecting on my work within marine protected areas, planning and sort of implementation, and there was a paper I shared, a science paper that I shared that sort of discussed the technical aspects of it. But essentially, there was it was about cumulative impacts, and it was around a marine protected area, or actually a marine reserve, that didn't allow any degradative or take activities, but does allow for scientific research to be conducted. And the managers at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife were like, okay, there's some spots that are super popular with researchers, and we're getting a lot of requests for research in what is supposed to be a no-take area. How do we assess the cumulative impacts of that? And when do we say yes? And when do we say no? And, how's our staff supposed to figure that out? And so there were a group of us, the working group, and honestly, we spent a lot of time. It took us 3 years, I think, to get this framework together. But we did come up with a framework that was a way that the system could take existing information, let a project proceed, learn from it, based on the basic parameters of a proposed project, assess the impact of it, how long the system would need to recover from that impact, because remember, a lot of the ecological systems can recover. And so we use basic information about similar projects, data on recovery and resilience times, the life history of specific organisms, how much of the specific area were they taking, and let that be an iterative process where each project that was proposed and executed in their reporting would feed into this system of knowledge to learn and to improve, but also to continue monitoring the cumulative impacts of the activities in the area. So I just shared that as, it's a problem in many areas of natural resource management and sort of development projects. And so, and I just, it's an example, a concrete example. It was, I think, and we ended up using that as a tool with the Fish and Wildlife Department. So I would love to follow up with them to find out how it's working for them, but give you an idea of an approach that could be developed. Is that kind of what you were referring to? That, yeah.
It could help us avoid completely reinventing the wheel. Like maybe it won't take us 3 years if we want to do something similar.
Yeah. I mean, it was probably focused mostly on sort of, intertidal, rocky shores, sandy bottom, the kinds of things that researchers do where they're collecting animals or manipulating an area to understand what it means to have a disturbance or, yeah. So, yeah.
So the idea being we have kind of our overall cap, our capacity for how much effect we can handle in a system. And then each successive action that you want to take inside that system, you can compare against your overall cap and say, well, we're still under budget, if you will.
Exactly. Or it's been long enough since this project has ceased and the system has recovered, we no longer have to include it in that base load, if you will, or that, that baseline. That can get retired, so to speak.
Jana?
Sorry. I very much agree with that idea of, everything needs to be compared to your cap, if you will. But I am feeling like in terms of this timing section that we're looking at the moment, I'm worried that we're really coming in strong with the idea that we have to understand fully this content. I mean, we have it written elsewhere that we'll use adaptive management when we don't understand things. And I know that this has been kind of the debate for this group the whole time. I think we're leaning really heavily towards understanding impacts fully ahead of time. And I just don't think, I think we're going to limit ourselves. We're not going to be able to move forward because we're just not going to, we're not going to understand everything ahead of time. Uh, and so I'm wondering if we can shift a little bit back towards the middle of like, we're going to try and have a better understanding, but that it's not going to be full and complete. And then those other options that you outlined above, the adaptive management option, and everything, that's where that comes into play. And there's actions the state can take to enhance that better than what we've seen in other regions to make sure that we're, reevaluating that cap and reevaluating how we stand, how we're situated under the, as new data comes in. But I guess as I'm reading this,
Shana,
would like to advise that we tone things down just a little.
To iterate, this cumulative assessment that I was talking about, just to place it, would not have been a before you can proceed thing.
And I'm looking at the specific before leasing piece.
Yeah.
I figured
it was done as an adaptive management approach. So I just also for Jeff, for the framing, it may not, that was not the intent that it sits in this before anything can be done space.
I also think, and I'm not sure how this fits in, Jeff, so I apologize, I'm throwing it out here and not sure how we write it into this. But things are changing at the national level or the federal level for how cumulative impacts and indirect impacts are being considered. There's on the one hand, the federal government under this administration is saying we don't know enough, and on the other hand, they're currently kind of undermining the institutions that we use to assess impacts. So, for example, there was just a Supreme Court decision that limits what can be considered as foreseeable actions when you're doing an impact assessment, and it limits it to only other projects within the federal agency's purview, that whatever the lead agency is. It makes it harder to make that assessment of cumulative impacts. There's a couple of those actions that have occurred at the moment. And so I'm wondering if we need to add some additional context to this document that talks about the additional limitations that we're going to see federally to doing impact assessment in as comprehensive of a way as we would want it to be in an ideal world, and even as comprehensively as it could have been done under the last administration. And I'm happy to help with that. I actually just wrote something related to that for a different, for something for California, it's for their entity, and comments on their entity related to ports. So happy to pass it along. But those are my two big concerns right now, is that we're setting ourselves up for some failure because we're not going to know everything before leasing.
Yeah, I mean, that is the dilemma, and it has been from the beginning. Our very first roundtable meeting, where when we said, okay, what does the path look like? There were many voices who said we need to understand the cumulative effects in some way before leasing occurs. And there is that push-pull there where we don't have lessees yet, so they won't be able to financially contribute to that necessarily. You have BOEM, who the way that they did it for California was to give out the 5 leases and then do some sort of cumulative look of what the effect of those 5 leases would be, which then the individual projects could pull from when they submit their individual projects. That didn't seem to be the preferred way to go in Oregon, that there's a desire for that information before leasing. And that creates a dilemma of, if the state wants that information before we act, then we need to put money on the bar, if you will, to actually make that happen. And taking your point too, that even if we did that, there would still be questions that are unanswered from a cumulative perspective. So the way that I was trying to thread that needle was to acknowledge that Oregon needs to understand the cumulative carrying capacity of the ecosystem before we issue a single lease, but that you could do that in more of a conceptual manner, that you don't need to know the specifics of every project, and that maybe some sort of sensitivity analysis could gather, well, it could be this or it could be that. So let's look at the range of possible effects. And then, as Karina mentioned, there may be some just physical science type of factors that we can bring in to say, well, for upwelling, for example, we know that if we pull no greater than X exajoules of energy out of the system, that the effect for the whole system is manageable. And we know that if you have an array of a particular size and configuration, there may be some localized changes that we've kind of got our arms around well enough to know that this isn't totally a deal breaker before we start. And so I think that's the tension that we have. I did put it in here to be kind of controversial and to push it because this is what people were asking for. And then to say, okay, well, this is what that means. And I've tried to add a little bit here based on the conversation I've just heard.
Well, I love knowing that you did it to be controversial, because when I read this, I was like, oh my God, we're never gonna have all these answers and we're never gonna leave. So I would definitely encourage pushing a little bit back towards the other way of, we're gonna try and better understand it, but we will not have all the answers ever, probably, just like with most science that we conduct. So it is helpful to know that you were pushing this argument so that we could talk about it more.
Jeff, could you clarify also, does this, we're addressing all of Oregon waters and areas where we have the GLD, and if a proposal came in for state waters, Oregon could do some things that it wants to do. I mean, like, it doesn't, it's a different set of, it would be a different process, permitting in state waters than in federal waters, correct?
It would. I'm trying to remember to what extent, because you would need a lease from the Department of State Lands or a special use authorization
Right.
in order to move forward with the project. But I don't think it's the way it works with BOEM, where you do the leasing first and then 5 years later there's a permit. I think it all kind of comes together.
And it would still have to go to FERC and all the other things, federal, probably, right? Because if it was connected to the grid and all that kind of stuff, like PacWave.
Yeah. Well, and PacWave hydrokinetic is FERC. I don't know that FERC would play a role in this.
Oh,
You would not have BOEM because there would not
Yeah.
be a lease of the Outer Continental Shelf, which means you would not have a construction and operations plan. That's a BOEM vehicle.
yeah,
If it were happening inside state waters, we have Territorial Sea Plan Part 5.
right.
And we have the DSL process for authorizations for use of the seafloor. And that's what we have.
And I think, given that this is, I think that might be something to clarify for folks overall, is that there are these, I'm not saying that, I've heard that y'all have gotten in the past some proposals here and there for state water usage for energy products. So anyway, it's just an interesting thing to consider for what this means. Does it mean in a federal process, Oregon would need to do that? In a state process, Oregon would need to, or to the extent that federal waters, this could be done or could not be done, or required. I just think that's given what this plan is intended for, might be helpful for people to understand the distinction.
Yeah, well, actually, in a way, it's kind of the same, because Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan would apply to a project in federal waters or a project in state waters. Part 5 gets triggered when you have a project, not when you have a lease. And Part 5 does require a cumulative assessment of effects. And so what happened with the state review of the BOEM leasing was Part 5 wasn't triggered yet, so that cumulative assessment was not triggered yet. But we were reserving the full right to say, okay, you can do leasing at your own risk, but just recognize that when you actually submit your construction and operations plan, the state is going to expect this cumulative assessment to be in hand.
But the feds could override that, right? Except for in the portions in state waters, right?
If the state were to object under the Coastal Zone Management Act, the federal agency is prohibited from issuing its permit unless there is a successful appeal to the US Secretary of Commerce. And the rules of that appeal are different. They don't second guess the state's interpretation of our own policies. They look at the project effects versus the national interest. And it's about 50-50 whether the feds will override a state objection. So there is a bit of a risk there. So to your point, yes, if a state just flat out denied a seafloor authorization from state lands for inside state waters, that's the state's decision. The feds can't override that.
That was the point I was trying to make. Sorry, clarify. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Dean.
So just offering my own perspective on what Shannon was discussing. To me, the research agenda should be aimed primarily at fulfilling a marine spatial planning effort. That's my own perspective. I don't know if that's how widely that's shared among this group or the larger group, but that's the way I've thought about it all along, is that, well, if we need to do marine spatial planning to be able to avoid impacts ahead of time, because BOEM's process will, once they lease areas out, I know from a visual impact standpoint, it's too late. It's done. You're going to have the impacts, and there's not much you can do about it. I don't know about it from all the other, resource perspectives. That may not be the case, but it is from a visual impact perspective, based on my experience in the East Coast. Research for me is a vehicle for fulfilling the marine spatial planning effort. And so then, having said that, then what should the research do? Well, it should identify the data gaps and then fill the data gaps as best as it can, to be able to do proper marine spatial planning. And what should the marine spatial planning do? It should identify those parts of the potential lease areas, or looking at the ocean offshore from Oregon, that are of high, middle, or lesser concern. At least 3 categories. And that way we know, if we know where these are the high concern areas, these are the low concern areas, and these are the intermediate areas, then that helps guide the future BOEM, if there is a future BOEM and a future administration that actually wants to get back in the business of renewable energy, which I think if we all didn't think that was going to happen, we all probably would just quit and go home at this point, right? So we are trying to avoid cumulative impacts, but we're also trying to avoid not just cumulative impacts, but also site-specific impacts on those sites that probably shouldn't be leased to begin with. And so to the extent we can identify those in the interim period that we have available to us, I think that would be great. So hope that helps.
I was silent to that part of it, but you're right. For us to have a successful state-led spatial planning, we're going to need some not only inventory information about what stands to be affected, but some sort of understanding of the range of possible effects that could come. I am curious, Karina, your comment in the chat about cumulative impacts in marine spatial planning should be connected. Can you expand on that a little bit? Where do you see the connection?
It's the spatial version of cumulative impacts, right? And I think that spatial planning also considers, well, both do cumulative impacts, social and natural science factors. But yeah, it's basically the spatial dimension of cumulative impact understanding. in the way I see it.
I think if I can add, we were also, or Jeff, I think you were also told by BOEM that they would defer to the marine spatial planning done by the state in making decisions. Is that set? I'm not incorrect there, right?
Per is a strong word, but they would
They
take
would
into
refer to
account,
it.
yeah, that if the state identified these areas, that would be a significant part of their decision making. Especially if
I
it
think,
relates to a policy that the state might object based on later.
I think then putting it here and that Dean and Karina both mentioned it, I'm glad we've reincorporated it back into here because it seems essential that we do that ahead of time if they're even going to, if they've even offered or teased that, hey, well, look at what you've done. It should be top
Seems
of
like
the
that's a
research
powerful
agenda.
tool for the state.
Yeah, it should be top of the research agenda for sure.
Yeah.
And that just pulls the need for funding support even further back to say, we don't want to do spatial planning until we have inventories of all these resources. But I myself go, well, does that mean we need to put a fleet of boats out there and buoys for a couple of years before we do spatial planning? Is that what we're saying? Or am I misunderstanding?
No. Can I just
Yeah,
want to
jump in,
add
Julia.
emphasis to what you just said, Jeff. You know, we do need to be careful about what we're committing to here. This sort of effort requires a lot of staff time and resources to complete the work. And we don't have, we have some, you know, at ODFW, we have some research capability, at sea research capability, but it's already dedicated and it requires a lot of funding. So if that's not already acknowledged in here, then we either need to explicitly say that this needs to be coupled with funding, or, okay, great. Thank you.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's
So much of what
highlighted.
we're discussing here needs a lot of funding.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yep.
Just want to make sure that's balanced. In that.
Delia was starting to feel the pressure on ODFW's
Yeah,
back.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we've got hands up. So Julia, go ahead.
I'll be super quick. I feel like we've been eking toward this and it's been kind of apparent in the direction of the conversation, but I just want to like explicitly say that what I'm hearing here and what I think is going to need to be shaping up through this recommendation is through these discussions and through written input, like it feels to me like we just need to gain clarity about what we need to know and can know on what timeline and how that can happen, right? And then probably within those options of how that can happen is going to be tiered based on resources, right? You know, but it's like I think in like really generalized broad terms, people into referring to like cumulative impacts as though we just need to know everything all at once. And it's like I think what we're figuring out as we get to the nitty-gritty here is we need to get really clear about what we can know at what times and how do we create a process that ensures that we do know what we need to know when we need to know it, which I know that probably isn't the most articulate thing in the world, but that's what I'm kind of starting to suss out from this conversation is like that's kind of what you're tasked with trying to do, Jeff, is kind of through these messy processes start honing in on those things that I just outlined. And I think we're getting there. This conversation is really rich and helpful, I think, in helping guide that. But I think this is going to be one of the more difficult portions to frame up because there's so many moving parts and the timeline is really like hard to figure out what you can know and when you can know it and when you need to know it. But I think that's kind of what we need to be getting into the weeds with as we continue developing this section together. But it's like clear that we're all leaning into it. So anyway, more of a generalized process comment, but I think that's the task at hand and we're really, it feels like we're making good progress today.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I just started adding into this a little bit is the scope of what we mean by cumulative projects, and that if you look at some of the NREL projections, I think it was, of how many projects could be on the Oregon coast, much less if you look in the California Energy Commission projections. Are we talking 2 wind energy areas has already been identified, or are we talking energy areas all the way up and down the coast, or something that's reasonable? Now, it's essentially, we want to bite off something that we can actually work with and not try to project the future into solving all of Oregon's energy problems with offshore wind, but not have to redo a cumulative effects assessment every time there's another project that's done. And by the third project, we say, oh, it's too late. You can't do that project because of cumulative effects, even to your project problem. So it's putting boundaries on it. And I'm not sure what's the best way to do that, but making sure that it's not open-ended.
Yeah, well, and Shana, I see you responding in chat that maybe you want to respond to that as well. The way that I've been conceiving of it, which may be totally wrong, is to think less about the projects themselves and more about the place you're going to put the projects, and say, how much could the region handle and how much could Oregon handle based on certain markers? And some of that might be socioeconomic impact, that we can't have just a ton around one particular port that would have an outsized effect. Or we can't have so many gigawatts that there would be a detrimental or unacceptable effect to ecosystems, species, habitats, uses, etc. But again, with this idea that we can't know everything all the time, there may be some conservative assumptions that we could make to at least give us the balance and say, we feel pretty safe that if we're a gigawatt or under total capacity, we like the ecosystem can handle it. And if we can space it out, maybe we can get up to X number or whatever. That seems to, as I've been hearing what people have been talking about over the last year, that's been kind of the desire, because people want to know, well, how big could this get, and when do we know when to stop? But
I like that. I think it's a good idea. My concern is that because California is moving ahead, and the CEC did their their final rule for projection. It basically included Del Norte and the Mendocino coast. Now, if there was the analysis that said the cumulative effects to the ecosystem, we've just met their capacity, does that mean that Oregon can't do anything? Much less put multiple projects in.
I won't speak for the whole state, but I would say that if the ecosystem can't handle more, then yeah, the last person through the door is out of luck.
Practicality of it, yeah.
Shana?
Thanks. I didn't raise my hand to respond to Bill's original question, but I do think you run into a challenge of doing the maximum case scenario only, where you're looking at what is the max that we can handle, because you're really not looking at the additional viable options. Like, yes, we could go to maximum impacts before we have some kind of environmental issue, but I think what's more productive for the state is to, yes, we can get that number, but have viable scenarios under that number that allow us to make good decisions. And I think that's been a criticism of the way sometimes BOEM conducts its impact assessment with the maximum case impacts, because you don't always get as much I guess, insight into the other viable options that are underneath that maximum scenario. If that makes sense. When you do like I'm talking about project assessment, not a programmatic assessment. But anyway, what I had originally raised my hand to contribute, I wanted to add to this timing of research needs section a nod to the third of the three options you had written above about how do we tackle uncertainty, about adaptive management. I think in terms of timing, we should require, or we should put on the schedule that adaptive management planning needs to be figured out in large part. I'm now second guessing myself, but I was going to say pre-permitting. I think when I've looked at the way projects have been evaluated on the East Coast, and how adaptive management has been incorporated into records of decision and final environmental impact statements, there's not always a requirement, I think, for adaptive management planning or for it to be fully fleshed out. But importantly, there's not always, I think, transparency about the triggers for what would lead a manager to then adapt. And I think Oregon could write that in now into our research agenda, that we have to have an understanding of what the triggers should be so that we can have a holistic adaptive management plan before a permit is issued. I am kind of internally debating with myself about whether or not pre-permitting is the right option, but I think it's the one that gives Oregon the most power over how the decision making process. I'm struggling with the practicality piece. So I don't know. I'm gonna say go with pre-permitting, but just know that I'm internally struggling with that recommendation.
Yeah. Well, I started jotting some stuff down as you were talking, but we can go look at it in a minute. And then Dean, I see your comment in the chat that if marine spatial planning was the way Oregon prepared itself for the next round of BOEM leasing, then the research agenda should be aimed at filling key data gaps in the 4 years of minimum time that we have. We can't know everything we need to know, but we can know enough to identify high, moderate, low concern parts of the ocean. So what I'm gathering from what you were saying is there's kind of the inventory side of information, and then there's the effects side of information, that our focus over the next 4 years can really be on that inventory side. Let's make sure that we know what we have. And then that effects piece could come, before leasing occurs, where we say, we know what we've got and we know that it's valuable. And now this cumulative impact assessment can be looking at, okay, what could the effect on those resources be in different scenarios? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very fair. Yeah. I mean, I have just recently been rereading works of Ian McHarg, who was the landscape architect who developed a book called Design with Nature, which, Jeff, you're probably familiar with. Some others might be or might not be, but he kind of introduced a lot of the environmental planning, ecological planning framework for regional planning back in the 1960s. And really I think what marine spatial planning is, at least to my mind, is it's an ocean version of what we do on land as far as sorting out where we should and shouldn't do things. Yeah, and in order to do that, the first thing is inventory. That's like the first thing on the list is you've got to have an inventory of what's out there. And, an ocean inventory is hard to do and it's going to be incomplete. And, we're not going to be able to get a bunch of submarines, out there very easily. But I know on visual resources, it would not be hard to do. It's not very demanding. On other resources, hidden resources, I think it's going to be more demanding, and some of those we might not be able to do. They might have to wait till later on, but we should do what we can do in the meantime.
jotting down some stuff for now, but if I'm saying stuff that clangs or that you would recommend changes to, please do chime in. Bill,
So
go
just
ahead.
jumping out of my lane for a second, if the rocky habitats, for example, that
Mhm.
Jeff, you pointed out earlier, if we knew that those were resources we wanted to protect, and if there was a way to find out where there's higher concentrations of rocky habitats, and where there are lesser concentrations, those would be the kinds of things that you could inventory potentially. I don't know if we can, ascertain that information or not, but if we could, we should.
Yeah, and it gets back to the scale, right? Like when we had wind energy areas, you had a box within which you could do some finer scale. Let's try to find the corals, for example. And the developers were going to be on the hook for that. And it was going to take sea time and money and time. But now if we're taking a step back from even that and saying potentially the whole coast off of Oregon is back open for consideration, the resolution of information that we would be able to use in spatial planning is probably going to stay kind of what we have now. We're not going to be sending ships doing lawnmower runs up and down the whole coast. So there's another dilemma there, I think, of what level of information could we realistically expect and fund to support spatial planning to get a good inventory.
Yeah, Jeff, to that point, I think that BOEM did that with NOAA in their spatial planning and did exclude a bunch of areas. But it was, again, it was focused down this end of the country, or the state. And one thing I suspect Kevin would echo as well is recognizing, as we all know very well, the ocean's changing. It is getting heat waves, and animals are moving around it when they can. So it's we can do a lot of data collection for things that aren't going to move, such as the rocky areas. But when we talk about the populations of various kinds of fish, various other things that are mobile, those will change. So there's a time element as to how good the data are and what their shelf life is. But that just complicates things. Doesn't mean we don't have to go look. We need to do it as best we can.
Yeah,
That's probably the best we could do it for. Yeah, I think you got it
good
there.
point. Okay. But really, when we're talking about a cumulative impact assessment, it seems like it's kind of a mix of let's bring in some like point source research about what we know about bird interactions with turbines, as one example, or what we know about changes to perception and property values related to visual resources. And those can be like points in there, but that really it's kind of a moving target of how the ocean will be changing, how habitats will be changing, and how project designs might be evolving. And so you kind of have to run multiple scenarios, and it almost seems like a modeling exercise. As I think Shana, you put in the chat of like a scenario, multiple scenario planning is maybe the real form that a cumulative impact assessment could take. I put a lot of stuff in here that I probably need to clean up. But this has been a good discussion, and I think core to many of our discussions over the last year. But what do we really need to know before leasing occurs? Moving on to the next phase of before a permitting decision is done, here again, to be like kind of throwing things out there to see what reactions we get, we say the specific questions identified in the research agenda must be resolved so that they provide sufficient evidence that the project will be consistent with state enforceable policies. And to me, that's not controversial because that's what our policies already require. that you need to have information about the effects, and we have certain standards that describe what level of effect is okay. And then if those research needs are not met at the time of the COP review, the state can extend the period of review until that information is available, or else object. And then I get into some other kind of individual timing considerations that Oregon should immediately begin coordinating with this West Coast Science Collaborative to meld our research needs, that we should support the early collection of baseline information that may be used in future evaluations. Here again, I get to the question, and I've heard it a few times, about, well, if we could just get some MET buoys out there early, we could be providing some information that would be useful to developers. But again, if we're back a step, and those wind energy areas may not be the areas that end up being the places, where would you put one? And how useful would a buoy be if it's not in the place that a developer is actually looking to develop? Go ahead, Julia.
This reminds me of a question I think you were looking into, and you may not have an answer for this yet, but have you gotten any clarity about what a process, or if there would be a process about reestablishing past WIAs under like a new administration? Has that been something you've gained any insights into?
Yeah, I did talk to BOEM staff last week, just looking for more understanding about that. Basically, I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit. The wind energy area as a concept was kind of an interim step that was created by BOEM. And I need to go back and double check this, but what they said was, well, it's not strict in the regulations that wind energy areas have to happen. What does need to happen is area identification. So you need to have a call, and you need to have area identification before you go to leasing. The wind energy areas were a process step developed by BOEM to stand in for the regulatory requirement of area identification. Now that the WIAs have been rescinded, there is no formal area identification in existence. And so it would be against regulation to do leasing today. And then I asked the question, well, what if somebody wanted to reestablish the exact same WIAs in the exact same place sometime in the future? Do you have to start over at the call area? And, or even if you don't have to start over at the call area, what is your administrative process? Because you've got a lot of information already in the federal administrative record that helped you choose the sites you chose already. Could you do it in a more abbreviated process? And the basic answer was they were unwilling to speculate, because it is not in the regulations how this occurs. It could go back to the call area stage, and that could be that. There could be some other process developed by some future administration that we just can't predict. But they did also mention that as of 2 weeks ago, Secretary of Interior put out another press release saying that they were going to do an overhaul of the renewable energy leasing regulations that they just overhauled last year. So the rules related to establishing wind energy areas could themselves change. So really all we really know is what is true today, which is that there are no wind energy areas and no areas identified for leasing.
Jeff, if I could add to that, and your understanding of that process is exactly the same as mine. I would just note that from NWF's perspective, the urgency to reevaluate the science and the decision making about what the original what new WIAs would be, considering that we have those original, would really depend on timing too. So how much time has passed since the rescission occurred and since those original areas were identified, that determines how much additional new information we have to consider. And so from my perspective, and I'm talking again for NWF, we've asked for in the past that if there's been a long gap in time between when a WIA was established and when leasing occurs, that there needs to be a some kind of reflection on any new significant science that has been developed. And so from my perspective, if I'm looking at, okay, well, we're not going to get new WIAs until potentially a new administration 4 years from now, we would probably advocate for new science to reestablish what a good what good site identification would look like. If it were to happen next year, that might be different again, but it would depend on like new science. And I think that should also inform our thinking about whether we can look to the past WIAs versus having to start from scratch. I hope that is helpful.
I think you want NEPA probably comes into that as well, right? That if your effects information is dated such that there's new stuff coming in, you at least need to take a look at whether a supplemental is necessary.
There's some debate about that. Like there's a part of it that I think is up to BOEM to decide if there needs to be a supplemental. But I will say in the past, when we've had large gaps on the Atlantic coast between steps in this process, we have advocated to BOEM often that they would need to do a supplemental or go back a step depending on what process piece we're looking at.
The only problem with that is we advocated for BOEM to do a programmatic assessment out here, because the one they did on the East Coast so long ago, that was when it was still MMS. And they said no. I said that it was the shelf life was way past. It was a completely different area. It was a different technology. And they said, no, we'll stick with our APA that we've currently got. What I was going to say is that for a changing of the wind energy area, just by the title itself, talks about where the wind energy is best. And it is far and away the best in Southern Oregon and Northern California. Even better than in Humboldt is off Del Norte. And so my guess is that would be, excuse me, a strong driver for reusing this wind energy area here, rather than doing it anywhere up and down the coast. And I believe it was NREL, maybe it was PNNL, that had looked at the levelized cost of energy, and the two areas that were identified were the best levelized cost of energy. So that it's going to push it strongly to just reactivate those, but then the wind energy is probably not going to change that.
Well, you have that, and then you also have, out of our roadmap process, a recommendation to do state-led planning that would presumably consider those WIAs in addition to other areas. We've talked about doing like the NCOS multi-layer modeling for the whole coast to really evaluate the relative suitability of those WIAs against areas that didn't get that level of analysis. And so we may end up with something that looks similar to what was there, and we may not. And that's, I guess, a dilemma for another day of if the state finds spots that are not optimal from a wind speed direction, then that leads to future decisions. But Hans.
Yes, I've been listening here, and I agree with everything about basically we need more human effects. I live on the coast about 30 miles south of the wave energy project. All right, that's a research project. And I would like to see something similar posed with wind energy project to see if we can both the feasibility of these as well as the costs. And probably saying some of that in your grand statements here. But I think I'd like to be more specific about maybe we should be funding a research project before we go on into a full, before we go into a full-scale project development here.
Well, that's something that we've talked about off and on throughout the roundtable discussions of should we be formally pushing for a pilot project? I guess where I've started to come down after hearing all the various conversations, the developers have said that if it's less than a gigawatt, there's not really interest from their side to fund it. And so it would have to be essentially the state self-funding a research project. State of Maine they petitioned the federal government to get a research lease, and we're going to enter into a business partnership with a developer to make a research array that was 100 and something megawatts in size. But my understanding was that kind of fell through with the change of administration and the price as well of the power that would come out of it. And so over here, just seeing that there wasn't a lot of regulatory appetite, that there wasn't a good, I guess, example. And then the real fact of the matter that California is kind of our pilot in a way, just because they are so far ahead of us now and are going to be even further ahead of us. I have yet to find like the sweet spot scenario of a pilot project that would work. I'm not close to it. I just don't know how we would get there. Delia.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on that discussion because we've been having versions of that discussion for many years. I agree with you, Hans, that the importance of starting with a pilot or demonstration project is very valuable in terms of figuring out how it relates to a number of concerns, community concerns, environmental concerns. We did have a proposal, the Principal Power Project, back in 2014, and worked through a lot of, what would a demonstration project add to the objectives of the state. And that project was unsuccessful. They were not able to find a power purchase agreement. And there was also a lot of disapproval from coastal communities. And so I think that my suggestion, Jeff, would be that somewhere in the roadmap, whether it's in the research section or somewhere else, we should just briefly discuss the importance of demonstration and pilot projects to the state without suggesting that the state would have to do it ourselves. Mention that we had the Principal Power Project, mention that there will be lessons learned from California, mention that there's the Cademo project in state waters off of California. So yeah, okay, so if it's already in here, great, but maybe it's not in the research section. Again, maybe it's somewhere else in the roadmap, but
Yeah.
I think that we can just address that by kind of discussing what we know about demonstration and pilot projects. Where we're going to get the best bang for our buck is most likely, I agree with you, the California leases, assuming that they move forward. So yeah, so anyway, just a couple things to remind the group that we have been having these discussions about the importance of demonstration and pilot projects to learn in sort of a phased approach. And that's also in our territorial sea plan, the importance of pilot projects and kind of a phased stepping into a new development without jumping all in. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for, representing that it is a state policy to have a preference for pilot projects. And so if we can, but to your point, the pilot maybe need not be in Oregon, that there may be other, at least what I'm gathering from your point, that we can look at history and we can look at what else is happening out there to.
Right. If the California leases move forward, in some respects, we could gather the information from that without necessarily having to conduct that installation and all of that here. So yeah.
Julia.
I'm trying to get an idea of whether or not a pilot project would be at a scale where you would have like one of the major concerns is effects on upwelling, and I just feel like, and there are other concerns that are similarly at that scale, and I'm just kind of curious to know if you're able to kind of get like a reasonable idea of effects on upwelling with something that's at the size of a pilot project? You know, like at what point? And that's where I do feel like we might just be getting more data that's useful from California because it will be project size. But that's kind of like my concern about the pilot approach is I'm not sure how well it addresses our concerns, given that large amount of the concerns are very much about these projects at scale. So, but I might be ignorant in that assumption too. So I just I just want to be really clear though about not only whether or not pilot projects pencil out, but whether or not we actually get the data that really addresses our concerns from them, right? You know, and then you get information about visual impact, you get information about do they actually work? Some people don't believe they will actually work. I think we have examples of them working. But anyway, that I just kind of as a person who really appreciates the cautionary principle, I'm also just kind of curious about if we're how much we're really addressing our concerns at a small scale pilot level. Okay.
I do think that this gets to something we talked about at the top of the call, which was kind of related to the benefit of overlap between research that's done elsewhere versus what has to be done in Oregon. And perhaps this discussion is highlighting again that maybe the research question, or excuse me, the research agenda needs to resolve what we can take away from other initiatives happening elsewhere, because obviously the main array is in pause, but if it were to move forward um, uh, before we did, what can we take from those lessons learned? There's also floating arrays in Europe. Obviously, we're not looking at the same ecosystem, but what can we take from those projects and what they're learning from utility scale projects in Europe or from utility scale projects in California? There's currently a new, so the RWSC equivalent for Europe, or for, excuse me, for the UK is called the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Program. They've just launched a whole new research initiative called like EcoFlow, totally focused on floating offshore wind impacts, including hydrodynamic impacts, a lot of the questions that we have. Again, I think maybe adding to the research agenda is a little bit more concrete ideas of what can we take from examples of existing research that's already happening, especially in light of the fact that I think a research array, despite Oregon's preference for it, is going to be incredibly challenging to implement and to get data from at the scale I think that we want to see. I do have a link for that. I will drop that in the chat.
Jeff, can I just chime in before this discussion moves on?
Mhm.
Shayna already captured most of what I was going to say in response to Julia, but I agree with you, Julia, that I don't know that any one development is going to answer all of our questions because we have a lot of questions. I agree also that upwelling is one of the most significant effects and directly relates to the cumulative effects discussion. What we have right now for the West Coast is modeling that was conducted for California based on those existing 5 leases, coupled with the potential next round. And then we have the PEIS from BOEM for those 5 leases as well. And so that is looking at those projects as an example of the effects to upwelling from those specific areas, including probably most important to Oregon, including the Humboldt leases. And I think the next step in my mind would be to couple that with what were our WIAs, although I don't think there's any traction to do that right now that the WIAs have been rescinded. So I think using those areas and sort of building them together for the cumulative effects on upwelling and ocean circulation is the approach that I'm in favor of. And I think that's where the modeling currently is. And so there's value in considering pilot or demonstration or small scale projects paired with those. But I think those are probably the best example of demonstrating the effects to important things, including upwelling, but also other important benthic effects, etc. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you for unpacking that. That's really, it gives me a fuller picture of how we approach this data collection. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Building on what the two of you have just said, I think that for me, that's one of the great values that we could have if we had kind of a broad participation state science collaborative, that we could have the discussion of, okay, upwelling is our uncertainty. How do we craft, based on what we have learned already in other regions, how do we answer the question specific to Oregon? But it also answers the question of, well, who needs to be convinced? How do we vet this with a broad spectrum of people who are interested so that they can all be at the same table to see that framework of how we would answer a question like this and to try to answer it in a way that is satisfying?
Totally. You're getting at what I was saying earlier about how do we express that we're trying to know everything we can know when we can know it in a way that instills confidence in people, right? It's the task.
I
We've got
would,
about 10 minutes. I have another meeting at 2 that I probably need to spend a couple minutes getting ready for. If there are other hot thoughts about this, Karina, I see your hand. Please chime in. We are going to meet again on the 26th for those who can make it. And if you have other thoughts, I'll send this marked up document out to the group so you can mark it up yourselves and kind of look at it all as a piece. What we haven't talked about yet are the funding support needs section that probably could use a little bit more emphasis. And then we already talked about the research collaborative piece conceptually, but any specific thoughts that would be welcome as well. So with that, Karina.
hey, thanks. I'm gonna have to hop at 2 also, but I just wanted to express appreciation for the conversation and insights from today. That was one. I was gonna put it in the text. But second, Jeff, your remarks about, and folks' remarks about, like, how do we tackle, like maybe we tackle a question like upwelling impacts. And I feel like, some of the work that Jack Barth has done, some of the work that's been reported at the National Academy's sessions recently around the California current ecosystem do give us some insights and answers to some of the questions that people are asking. It's not everything, but I think at the big scale, kind of some basic understanding of whether the scale of offshore wind being proposed or being, developed now, how that would potentially impact the system as a whole versus specific locations. That is a educational opportunity we could capitalize on now. Like, there is enough information and specific attention and modeling that people could start getting a handle on basic answers to that question.
Karina, you talked about in the work that Stack is doing, taking a couple example uncertainty areas and kind of taking it as far as you can take it. Can I put in a pitch for that being one of your?
I'll have to get, the problem is the expert isn't on the Stack. I have to see if I can get the expert or a couple experts who can do that with us on an ad hoc basis. But yeah, that could be one of them.
Yeah. Well, you had that chapter for, was it for Ocre?
Yeah, we have the chapter. So, but it's
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. There's actually some products and some thinking that have happened that I think we haven't done as good a job as we could have on educating and communicating what we've learned from that work. So yeah. Anyway, that's one of those ones that can be answered in part by modeling and physical analysis.
I think we might need to get a little bit meta about explaining why modeling is useful, because some people are distrustful of modeling and we're not going to fully address that, but some baseline education on how modeling works
by studies done in other areas. Like,
Yeah.
this is the, and having a pilot project somewhere else, you're going to run into the same challenges where people think that things are so substantially different here that they have to replicate everything here. And that's a challenge. We face that with the Marine Reserves issue, development too. And there's some things you do have to do specifically and empirically, but some things you can at least get a first order answer to without. All right. Thank you all. This is helpful for my work on Stack too. So appreciate hearing all of you.
Yeah, go ahead, Shana.
So it's so hard to think about all the things we want in terms of research, and then of course to end with the limitations of funding. And I just really quickly, I'm not sure, Jeff, what you think the capacity is for doing this, but I feel like in order for us to flesh out that last section as best as we can, we probably should have some type of estimation about what the funding requirements are actually going to look like. And I think we can do some of that. Like I might, before I head out on maternity leave on Friday, might be able to help get those pieces rolling for thinking about, like, okay, what would it cost to do marine spatial planning? What would it cost to stand up these science tables? Like I could reach out to the science tables I sit on and ask, okay, what's the funding that's required for this? Because then I think it will help us think through our options a little bit clearer in this research agenda. I do think, though, that we can perhaps add some additional insight into our current context into that section about, where things stand with, federal research dollars, federal funding, and the likelihood that we're just not going to get, I think, federal funding at all. But I'm wondering if that would be helpful, if I should pursue that, or if you'd rather hold off for a future document at this time. But I do think we're looking at private funding essentially as being our viable option. I guess maybe I'm ignorant of Oregon's budget. And
no, you're totally right, Shanna. You're totally right. Your instincts are on track. Continue.
But yeah, well, thank you for that encouragement. I guess I was kind of eliminating that from my mind and thinking, okay, we're going to have to think about private funding, and having some numbers will give us better ideas of target. And I do believe, Jeff, if I'm not wrong, that the bill that established this process, doesn't it include the ability to use private funding for some of the work?
It does. I'm unclear as to whether that's for just production of the roadmap itself or for follow-on activities that would implement the roadmap.
Okay.
That's my understanding as well, Jeff. It's for development of the roadmap.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But we can request that moving forward, though. That could be one of the requests, that like the state be open to public resource money for funding the implementation of the roadmap. I mean, that's a big part. I think the roadmap is figuring out how we continue to move forward and be iterative.
Well, Jeff, do you think that it would be helpful to try and get some of that information nailed down? Or if I can't do it in the next week, at least NWF folks kind of getting that process going so we can add that to this document.
I think that at least an order of magnitude estimate could help people understand what is needed. Sure. I mean, I know New York spent $10 million on their sea space suitability plan, which included putting out a buoy and doing visual resource work and doing a process and all that. So you got that piece. And I can't remember what the spatial planning we did for part 5 was, but it was not 10 million, but it wasn't less than $1 million either. And yeah, understanding the science collaborative piece, I think, would be important. The how do you fulfill the research agenda question is kind of the how long is a piece of string question. That, right. That one would be difficult to lock down, but that could also be one of the follow-on recommendations, that if Stack can take the research agenda so far, but there needs to be a follow-on effort to really flesh that out, that part of that fleshing it out could be to be not only with the research agenda, but like prioritization based on cost. I think like I understand that there are probably some expectations that the roadmap get to that level of detail. I don't know how realistic that is for that to happen in the time and with the resources that we have, but we can at least take it as far as we can and then outline the next steps to get it there.
And I think it'd be good to think about if we're doing something like ladder buoys and things like that, like co-benefits, like what are other agencies and research needs that the state has where this isn't just for offshore wind, right? Like I think approaching it that way. And I also want to make sure, well, anyway, we're at time. I'll reach out to you directly, Jeff, with a couple of ideas. But like, yeah, this was really fruitful.
Great. Well, hope to see you all next week when we do this again. But again, I'll be sending this document out, and feedback any which way is welcome. And we'll talk again.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.